Alright, so we are going to start by covering round number 6 here from the Tata Steel Chess Masters today. Big matchup between Richard Rapport, who's in first place, and Magnus Carlsen, who is in second place. Magnus playing with white pieces. Obviously, Magnus has set his goals to get to 2,900. If he wants to approach that goal, he's going to have to start winning some games. Alright, so knight f3 is played by Magnus. Richard plays d5 here. Magnus goes d4, and now we have knight to f6. c4, e6, very standard from Richard. And now Magnus once again chooses to play g3 with the idea of playing the Catalan opening here. Now he's had some great success. Obviously he beat Jan with it in the World Chess Championship. He won a game earlier in this tournament against Anish Giri as well. So clearly this is his go-to opening at the moment. Now one thing that a couple of people in chat have asked earlier today is, well, if Magnus is playing this every game with lots of success, why doesn't everybody play it? Now the main reason that you don't see it every game, even from Magnus for that matter, is that not everybody plays the same lines against various opening setups. So for example, after bishop g2, after g3, Richard chooses to take the pawn on c4. Now there are many lines, as I've said before. D takes c4, bishop g2, knight c6 is one line. You can go a6 here. There's also bishop b4, bishop d2, a5. So due to the plethora of lines that exist in this position, not everybody plays the same setup. If, for example, Richard played bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, d takes c4, I strongly suspect that Magnus would not have played the Catalan defense or Catalan opening today. However, Richard plays d takes c4, bishop g2, and now he plays knight c6. And here Magnus plays the first somewhat surprising move. I wouldn't say it's a big surprise, but he castles here. Normally queen a4 is the main line, and after bishop b4, bishop d2, knight d5, there are many variations here. I myself have a great affinity for this line with black because I've played it many times. First time and one of the most successful times was against Vladimir Kramnik in the London Chess Classic in, I believe, 2010 or 2011, but I believe it was 2010. All right, so back to the game. So castles is played here by Magnus, and now we have rook b8 played by Richard, and now bishop to e3. Now this is a very strange move, putting the bishop here in front of the pawn at e2. Ideally, you'd love to push the pawn in the center to like e4, but again, you're struggling. If you play e3, black can play a move like b5 and bishop b7, and you're sort of left with the question how to develop the rook, the knight, and the bishop here on the queen side. So after rook b8, bishop to e3 is played. Now the idea is very simple. White is not considering pushing the pawn in the center. You just want to go after this pawn on c4 with like knight d2, maybe queen c1, maybe even b3, depending on the exact setup. So after bishop e3, bishop to d6 is played. Logical developing move. Black, of course, wants to castle the king out of the center. We get queen c1 by Magnus, and now we have b5. Now it's worth noting black can try to hang on to the pawn with knight to a5 here, but it doesn't really do a whole lot because white goes bishop d2, attacking the knight. If you move the knight back to c6, white can just take the pawn on c4. If you play b6 to try and guard after bishop takes a5, b takes a5, knight bd2, white has a very, very pleasant position. There's e4 to push in the center. You can also gobble on c4, and these pawns on a5, a7, and c7 are all very, very weak here. So knight a5 would not be ideal. So b5 is played by Richard, and now Magnus goes b3, and now black can no longer hold on to the extra pawn. If you try to take the pawn on b3, you'd lose the knight on c6. If it wasn't checked, for example, say I could get some random position like this, you could go b2 and win the game. But again, unfortunately, after queen takes its check, and when you block, I just go back to c1, no b2, and you're down a piece. So you can't take the pawn, and again, if you go knight a5 to try and guard, you'll have similar problems after bishop to d2, attacking the knight on a5 here. So bishop b7 is played by Richard, pawn takes, and now Magnus takes the pawn, and we have even material once again. Knight b4 is played by Richard, a3 by Magnus, logical move. Now again, in retrospect, I kind of do wonder why Richard did not simply castle here. If he was going to give back this pawn freely, it doesn't really make sense to me why he didn't castle. So we get this position, queen c4. Now knight b4, a3 is played, knight d5. Not bishop a6, by the way, because after bishop a6 here, it looks really good. You attack the queen, you attack the pawn on e2, but after queen to c1, if you move the knight to d5, I go check on c6, winning the bishop on a6. And if you take on e2, I just take the knight here, you take my rook, and after bishop f1, white has a bishop and a knight for the rook, and long term, this should be technically winning for white. Generally speaking, a knight and a bishop are worth more than a rook in most cases, but if you do want to see an example where the rook and a pawn was equal to a bishop and a knight, take a look at the game today played in round 6 between Vidit Gujarati and Jan Christos Duda. So knight b d5 is played here, bishop to g5 played by Magnus. Again, you do not want black to capture this bishop. Say you play knight d2. After knight e3, fe3, white is completely fine here, but you do have these double pawns, one on top of each other, and they're not really well positioned. So bishop g5, now castles is played, and now knight bd2. It's worth noting that on first glance you might be like, wait, but e4 just wins the game, because if black tries to capture the pawn, bishop takes queen, and if you say move let's just say what's another move, maybe knight e7 for example, white can go e5 to fork the bishop and the knight. But after e4 is played here, black can play knight b6, attacking the queen and also opening up the diagonal. And after queen to e2, black can even take the pawn on e4 here. If white takes the bishop, knight takes queen, bishop takes queen, rook takes, and black simply has an extra pawn. And if you take on f6, after bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, queen takes f6, again black is up a pawn and much better here. So you don't want to go e4, so instead knight bd2 is played. h6 is played by Richard. Again, you do want to break this very nasty pin. Bishop takes knight, knight takes bishop, and now rook fc1 is played here by Richard, or by Magnus, sorry. And we've reached a pretty decent middle game position. Both sides of castle are kings. The black has the bishop pair here, but at the same time you have a slightly compromised pawn structure. You have the a7 pawn and the c7 pawn, which are a little bit weak. Knight d7 is played here by Richard. Again, you kind of would love to get rid of this pawn. It's a big problem long term. So knight d7 is one way to get rid of it. Your idea is simply to push the pawn to c5 on the next move and get rid of the weakness, and then a7 shouldn't be that big of a problem. But here queen a4 is played by Magnus. Very logical move to attack the pawn, and Richard decides, you know what, I'm going to go c5 here. I'm not going to try to defend this pawn with a move like a6. So after a6, rook a b1, again there is a little bit of pressure here with the rooks on c1 and b1 targeting the bishop on b7 and the pawn on c7 here. So c5 is played by Richard, and by the way, this is a completely reasonable move. There is nothing wrong with it. So Magnus grabs the pawn on a7, and this is where Richard essentially makes the blunder and loses the game. While the computer says it's still playable after this next move, it becomes extremely unpleasant. Now in this position, during my live commentary with GM Benjamin Bach, we both expected to move bishop to d5, creating the classic wooden shield here in the center of the board, and Magnus would have had to go queen to a4 here, but after c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight b6, black is getting adequate compensation because white is to move the queen after bishop e5. There's a lot going on here right in the center of the board, and white can't really claim an advantage. So bishop d5, it was very surprising not to see this move because it seemed logical. Instead, Richard takes, and now this is where Magnus, with his very simplistic approach, just takes back on f3 with the bishop. And now we reach this position after c takes d4 and rook a2, where the material is even. Black has these 5 pawns that are connected versus 4, but this a pawn on a3 is extremely strong long term because the bishop covers the a8 square, and you can also push the pawn all the way down the board potentially, and d4 is still weak as well. So after this happens, it's a very difficult position to play. So queen e7 is played by Richard, and now Magnus goes a4. Now you probably might wonder why rook a2 versus a4. The reason is that after a4, black can go bishop b4 and target this knight on d2. So after rook a2, queen e7, a4, now if you go bishop b4, I just gladly capture the pawn, and I'm up a pawn, and this a pawn is rolling up the board. So a4, rook fd8 played by Magnus, and now we get queen takes d4. You would love to play bishop c5 here, but after bishop c5, white can take. You cannot capture with the knight because you would lose your queen on e7. And after queen c5, queen d7, white again has a bishop and a knight for rook, and you still have this a pawn, which is gladly going to be rolling down the board very soon. The rook fd8 is played with the idea of bishop c5, but now white can gobble the pawn. Rook b4, queen to c3. So here everything is pretty much simplified now. White just very simply has this one lone extra pawn at a4, but in typical Catalan fashion, this bishop on f3 is a monster. So knight b6 is played here, a5 played by Magnus. Again, very simple, just use this pawn, push it up the board. Queen to a7 played by Richard. Now this is kind of the start of the game really spinning out of control for Richard to where it's just losing. He could have tried knight to d5 here, but after bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen d3, long term white should be much better. Again, it's not losing on the spot, but with his past a pawn and a rook behind it marching up the board, combined with now a second weakness of the pawn on d5, this should be very tough to play for black. And indeed, I suspect that with perfect play it's still losing, but the game would not end as rapidly as it did. So after a5, queen a7 is played here. You cannot capture the knight because now you'd lose the rook on a2. So you get queen to e3, bishop to e7 played by Richard, and now rook c2. Again, initially you look and you think, well, white's only up a pawn, you still can't take, you lose the rook. Additionally, I now threaten bishop g5. There should be a lot of threats, but Magnus, in his not in his merciful fashion, in his ruthless fashion, does not give Richard any hope. He plays rook c2, connects the rooks. Now pawn takes knight as a threat. Additionally, now after bishop g5, the knight is not hanging because you go queen c5, rooks guard it. You're also threatening a takes b6 as well. And now after bishop to e7, last ditch, you could try a move like, well, I guess if you go knight c8, you just lose the rook. And if we go back 2 moves, if you go knight c8 right here, guarding against the queen trade, white has a brutal tactic. Rook takes knight. If you take the rook, you lose your queen. And after queen takes queen, I take the rook with check, take back, and after pawn takes queen, you'll notice once again, knight and a bishop versus a bishop, completely winning for white. So bishop g5, queen c5 is played, attacking both the knight and the rook. Now bishop e7 is played, not bishop takes d2, by the way, because after bishop d2, white can very simply take the bishop here. And now after rook b1, king to g2, you have to trade the rooks. And again, this pin is deadly. You cannot go knight c8 because I just eat the knight. And if you don't go knight c8, I just take your knight on b6 here, and you resign the game. So after queen c5, bishop to e7 is played here by Richard, and now pawn takes knight, played by Magnus. Again, a perfect move. If you take the queen, I take your queen. And, well, I guess after pawn takes, bishop takes, rook takes, white has an extra knight and a bishop. More than enough material to win the game. And so Richard takes the rook here on a2. And Magnus does not hurry it. He does not take the queen, because after rook takes queen, bishop takes queen. Black is actually completely fine, because you have 2 rooks and a bishop against a rook, a bishop, and a knight. So Magnus, instead, after queen a2, takes the bishop on e7. And after queen takes rook, Magnus takes on d8, king to h7, he goes b7. And here Richard resigns in view of the fact that the bishop guards the pawn. Pawn can go to b8 next move, and you're simply lost. And once again, in true Catalan fashion, this bishop on the long diagonal decides the game for Magnus here. So what do we learn here? As I said during the live stream, as I said during our live coverage of the event where I was covering with GM Benjamin Bach, I am actually going to go and take a look after my stream today, and I do want to see if Richard plays a lot of these setups, because it felt to me that in this position, out of the opening, right about here, it felt like Richard was not super familiar with these setups with the bishop on b7 and d6 and the ideas of playing c5. And this is one thing that also you have to do, besides just pure opening research into your opponent's games, is you have to see what sort of structures they played. And it feels like in this game, Richard was very uncomfortable with the setup. He did not quite figure out how he was supposed to position the pieces, and that's why he lost the game. So it wasn't purely about the prep. It was Magnus also understanding that Richard does not play a lot of these setups, and therefore Magnus gets a very nice clean win. Most of these moves that he played even were pretty smooth. There was not really a lot of complication, and so this was harkening back to the classic Magnus, who plays a lot of positional squeezes, and this is just as good as any of them.